Once again, class. So this is the third part of my presentations about the mean and standard deviations applications. So this time we are going to talk about the measures of relative position using the z-score as a standard score. So most often than not, class, when we gather data and we want to compare different data sets, so most often than not, their values are unstandardized or not standardized. Like for example, you want to gather the data on the height of children, then you also gather the data on the weights of adult people. And if you want to compare now their data, so definitely by the values that we have are really different. So one is talking about the height, the other one is talking about the weight. So these are unstandardized. So the only way for us, class, to let's say compare is for us now to convert them into a standard score like the z-score. Okay, so that's how we are going to use now the formula, and this is what we mean by measures of relative position. So a measure of position, class, it's a measure that is used to compare values from different data sets or to compare values within the same data set. So the basic tools are the following. We have the z-scores, quartiles, deciles, and percentiles, but we are using the z-score, or we call this now sometimes a standard score, is found by converting a value to a standardized scale, because we want to standardize the result, class, so we need to convert them into a standard score called the z-score. So a standard score called the z is the number of the standard deviations that is given value x, either which is above or below the mean, and it is found using this formula, class. So on the left side, this is the formula to convert your individual scores into a standard score called the z. So we have to subtract the individual or the observed score by the mean of that data set divided by the standard deviations. So it's possible, class, that the result is positive or negative. The other formula, class, here, this is actually the same with the first one on the left. However, this is being rewritten so that we can standardize the scores to another, perhaps another standard score besides your z, provided, class, that we know the z-score of each of those individual scores. Okay, so let's go back again to Bogart's grades. Okay, so most often than not, if you are going to look at the grades of Bogart's with 7 different subjects, and if you are asked in which subject did Bogart performs the best, performs the worst, or poorly, are there any subjects that Bogart's grades are considered unusual? Then we want to find out also, what if we are going to convert all the grades of Bogart's from the different subjects into a psychology grade? Now, most often than not, we go directly at looking at the data. We see that 90 is the highest grade of Bogart. Then you could say, therefore, that Bogart performs the best in history or in psychology, because these two are the highest grades. And looking at English, 84, this, or Rizal is 83. So you could say that Bogart's grade of 83 in Rizal indicates that he performs poorly or worse in Rizal. The reason why we do not do this, class, because remember, these are not standardized. There are many factors to consider. One, we cannot directly compare the grades from the different subjects. Second, what about the, let's say for example, the items in the quiz, how many, the items in the exams, how many quizzes are there, and of course the teacher factor as well. So how are we going to convert them into a standard score? So we need to convert them into a z-scores, and that's the only time, class, for us to answer the questions. Okay, so given the mean grades, okay, so this is Bogart's individual grades. These are the mean grades of the whole class. Okay, so in other words, in English, like for example, the mean grade is 87, but his grade is only 84. So he is 3 points below the mean grade. Now, his grade of 90 in history, but the mean grade in the class is 89, so his grade of 90 is 1 point above the mean grade, with, of course, the standard deviation. So these are important class when we convert them into a z-score. So these 7 grades of Bogarts will be converted into z-scores, and that's the only time that we can answer the questions. So remember, these are now the grades of Bogart. This is the mean grade of the class with the standard deviations. So what we're going to do is to use the formula of your Z. So the individual grades of Bogart minus the mean grade divided by the standard deviations, then round your answers to 2 decimal places. So here we already have negative 2.14, indicating class that Bogart's grade of 84 is 2.14 standard deviations lower than the mean grade. Thus, we have a negative results. So math grade of 89 minus the mean grade of 86 divided by the standard deviations will give us a z-score of 2.5. So if you're going to convert all these individual grades of Bogarts into a standard grades or a standard score called the Z, then these are now the corresponding z-scores. And these are the standardized score already. So the higher the z-score in terms of grades, the better. The more negative the scores, the z-scores in terms of grades, the worse the performance will be. So that's how we interpret the results. Now, in this case, these are already the converted z-scores when we convert the grades of Bogart individually. So in which subject did Bogart performs the best? So all you have to do is to look at the highest z-score. So the most positive z-score is 2.5, therefore he performs the best in math, although his grade is 89 compared to the other subjects. So as I said, we cannot directly compare the grade of math to the other subjects, but what we can do is to convert Bogart's grade relative to the mean using the mean the standard deviations into a standard score. Later class, you will see if you're going to standardize all these grades into a psychology grade class. We can see it later on. Now, in which subject did Bogart performs the worst? So in this case, you have to look at the most negative. So the most negative is negative 2.14. So that indicates that Bogarts performs poorly or the worst in English. Okay. Although his grade of 84 is a bit higher than in Rizal. But in terms of the standard score Z, so the grade of 84 in English is equivalent to negative 2.14. Okay. So, the other questions is that, are there any subjects that Bogart's grades are considered unusual? So, according to the rules, any z-score beyond positive 2 or negative 2 are unusual values. Although we already computed class their individual grades into a z-score, then we can use the z-scores rather than, again, using the usual values formula. So as long as the z-scores is within negative 2 to positive 2, they are usual. Any z-score that is less than negative 2 or greater than positive 2 are unusual. So in this case, we can see clearly that there are two grades of Bogarts that are greater than and less than the lower and the upper limit of your 2. So negative 2.14 is below negative 2. So this is considered to be an unusual grade. While 89, which is equivalent to 2.5, is greater than 2, positive 2, which is again considered as an unusual grade because it already exceeded the positive 2. So Bogart's grade of 84 in English is unusually low relative to the class mean grade, while his grade of 89 in math is also unusually high relative to the class mean grade. So as of the moment, class, you cannot really appreciate Sir, why is that? Because we still have 90 as the highest grade and 83 as the lowest grade. So, as I said, we cannot, okay, compare directly because these are not standardized. So, once we standardize this into a z-score, that's the only time that we can now compare, okay, with one another. But of course, the z-score as a standard score class is not really appreciative. We cannot really appreciate this one class unless we are going to convert this into another standard score. Could be a standard grade using any of these grades. Okay, so we can do that class. Okay, so since we already have our z-scores for the 7 grades, then we convert all Bogart's grades into a psychology grades. In other words, class, if we want the psychology grade as the standard grade, then we can transform the other grades into a psychology grade. Okay. So, because we want the psychology grade as the standardized, okay, grade, though the mean grade for psychology is 89 with a standard deviation of 1.6. So, we need these two values. So, we identified here the mean grade is 89 with a standard deviation of 1.6. Then we use this as our formula. So the mean for the psychology grade is 89. The standard deviation for the psychology grade is 1.6. So your Z here is your Z scores that corresponds to the other subjects. And that's the one that we are going to substitute. So all of these Z scores class will be substituted in this formula. And what we get is the grades equivalent in psychology. So if you want to convert the grades of Bogart in English of 84 into a psychology grade, it will be changed. Likewise in math, science, ethics, history, and Rizal using this formula. So if we're going to use the formula, okay, so there we have the 89 as the main grade in psychology plus the z-score of the individual grades times the 1.6 as the standard deviations of the psychology. So psychology class remains the same because we are not converting this to itself. So that remains to be 90. So here you can now see, okay, the equivalence of the grades. So from 84 when converted to a psychology grade is 86, 89 when converted to a psychology grade is 93, and so forth and so on. So we can now see here clearly, class, that these are now the transform grades. From the different subjects, we converted this into a psychology grade equivalent. Okay, so we can now see clearly why that Bogarts performs the best in math, because when we converted this into a psychology grade, it is equivalent to 93. Okay, and the lowest is English. So his grade of 84 when converted into a psychology grade is equivalent to 86. So you can now see here clearly that the highest grade that Bogart is actually 93 in terms of psychology grade, and his lowest grade now is 86 based on the psychology as our basis class of converting it. So we can now directly compare once we were able now to convert them into another grading system. So that's how we use this concept class. So we cannot directly compare right there and then. First, we need to convert them into a z-scores. Then perhaps if you want to convert again your grades into another grading system like in psychology grade, then we can use this formula and we can now see the differences now. So this time you can now directly compare it. So the highest grade now is 93 and the lowest grade is 86. So actually, it's 85.6 in particular, so English. Okay, so that's how we use class D, uh, the Z scores, okay, or the standard scores that we know. Okay, so another one is like this, ayan. So we can now see class, the equivalence. Okay, so highest is still the math, the lowest is still the English. Based from this class, 85.6, although here we have 86.2. Okay, so which is actually the same from our previous answer class, that which subject did Bogart performs the best, performs the worst. So we have the math and the English. So since we converted Bogart's different grades into a psychology grade standard, so we can now see clearly in which subject did Bogart performs the best and the worst, or the poorest, as we see it. Okay, so that's how we use now converting, okay, a score into a z-score, which is a standardized, then from z-score into another uh, standard grades or standard score that we choose. Okay, now this one here, ayan. So what about if you're going to convert Bogart's grade into an IQ score? Can we do that? Yes. So still we have the same z-scores that we solved earlier. So all the 7 scores converted into z-scores, then we use the z-scores to convert these grades into an IQ scores. So the IQ score class has a mean of 100 with a standard deviation of 15. So we're going to use now these values here. So the mean is 100 plus your z corresponding to this z scores here times 15 as the standard deviations for the IQ scores. So doing this, okay, so we apply again. So 100, you notice these are all 100 plus the z-scores times the standard deviations. Then IQ scores class are typically whole numbers. And here we can see clearly that these are already the IQ scores. So the higher the IQ scores, the more intelligent you are, as they said. The lower the values of your IQ scores, I do not know, class, if you could consider it as idiot or whatever, or morons, we do not know. So that's very derogatory terms. Okay, so these are already the IQ scores equivalents of the grades of Bogart. So in English, down to psychology. So if you're going now to rewrite them, we now see already that in terms of IQ, because we were able now to convert them into a standardized score in terms of IQ, his math grade of 89 when converted to IQ class is 138, and that is very superior. You could just imagine, class, okay? While his grade of 84 in English when converted into an IQ score is only 68, which is extremely low. So talagang mababa siya talaga sa English class, mataas siya masyado sa math. Ayan. So these are already the converted IQ scores class. So that's the use of your standardization class. So again, once you're going to compare the individual scores or grades from one another, so you have to convert that into a z-scores. Then you just look at the result of your z. And of course, if you're going to convert again that z-scores equivalence into another standardized scores, then we can do that, such as the case for this one, class. Okay, so I hope you learned something from this presentation, class. And this ends our lesson for this week. So I'd advise you, class, to still read and review our learning packets, because those are the detailed ones. So there are lots of examples there, okay, which are detailed in nature. So still you can use that one, class. Okay, this is just an additional, okay, handouts for you, or an additional review notes for your class. So once again, thank you and see you next time, class. Bye bye.